This is the second of our autumn seminar series. This one is themed on adders, and we're looking at adders in the 21st century, since they're not doing so well. Nigel Hand is our Master of Ceremonies. He's also a trustee of ARG UK, ecologist at Central Ecology, and a member of the Herefordshire Amphibian and Reptile team. So welcome to Nigel. We've got 1 more minute and we're bang on now. So Nigel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Angie. Welcome everyone, evening tonight. It's the first online adder conference or seminar that we've done, so please acknowledge that, and it's all a learning curve for all of us, really. It's actually the fourth Vanishing Viper seminar that we've done. The first mention of adders was at the Kent University in 2011, November 2011, and that was held obviously at the University of Kent.
Actually, Nigel, University of Greenwich, please.
Is it? Oh, University of Greenwich. Sorry, Rick. And then, actually, at that conference, the adder was declared the herptile species in the UK under the most dramatic decline. And from that one, we then had Somerset ARG host under John Dixon the first Vanishing Viper conference in 2016 in Somerset. And then in 2019, the third Vanishing Viper conference was at Bangor University, hosted by the Bangor Herpetological Society. And so we continue to plough the plight of the adder into the future, and obviously, hopefully, get it on the agenda in the conservation world. So the next, so where are we going to go from there? So I'll just go through the evening's order of events. So at 7:45, we have Tom Simpson, who's Reserve Manager for Natural England at the Wyre Forest National Nature Reserve. It's a site I know very well. And obviously a lot of work was done over there in the 90s up until recently by Sylvia Sheldon and Chris Bradley. And then at 8 o'clock to 8:15, we have Gaetan Ray. I think Rick probably knows a bit more about Gaetan. Can you give an introduction to Gaetan at all, Rick?
Well, Gaetan works for the Conservatoire d'Espace Naturel, Nord-Pas-de-Calais, which is just across the channel from us. And here in Kent, we've been very lucky to have a couple of projects together with the Conservatoire and their volunteers. And Gaetan has been their leader and has led us to many fine meals, some excellent field work, and we all thoroughly enjoyed ourselves.
Great. And then at 8:15 to 8:30, we actually Rick doing talking about the adders in Kent. Rick's obviously part of CRAG, the Kent Amphibian and Reptile Amphibian Group, and you are still the scientific editor of the BHS Herp Bulletin, aren't you, Rick?
I am the editor of the bulletin. That's great. Yes.
And at 8:30 to 9 o'clock, we have a roundup of the evening and questions and answers. I believe, Angie, that people can feed their questions over while the conference is ongoing.
Yeah, if they put them in the Q&A box, what we'll try and do is pick out the most interesting ones. I mean, if we get hundreds, we'll pick out the most interesting ones. If we get 3 questions, we'll answer them all.
So in reality, I don't know, it's been hard to not ignore the situation with wildlife at the moment and biodiversity. David Attenborough was on the telly on Sunday talking about extinctions and potential extinctions and habitat decline. And today we've been hearing about other issues for wildlife as well. We've heard today about the decline of water bodies as well. And river systems and streams are not in very good health. I believe it's the 10th anniversary of the Making Space for Nature as well. The Lawton report came out on the 16th of September 2010, and Sir John Lawton has actually written to the Prime Minister acknowledging the impacts, and there's been little established effort and anything done to improve the actual situation. the principle of bigger, better and joined up nature spaces hasn't really been accomplished, and it's something that we'd like to see accomplished. And I think it is the only way forward for species like the adder. Bigger, joined up nature reserves are what we really need. And I've certainly seen it with my own work, with the telemetry work, that linking adder populations is probably the way forward to basically see them into the future. So shall we go on to the first speaker, Tom Simpson?
Yeah, that's fine.
A little bit of an introduction, Tom. You're obviously the Natural England Reserve Manager for the Wyre Forest National Nature Reserve.
Yeah, so I cover Wyre Forest National Nature Reserve, Mockers Park, Flits and Mockers Hill Woods. So 5 sites, basically bordering sort of 2 counties. A mixture of the Wyre Forest itself, and then a little wetland site that Flits, and one of the most internationally important wood pasture sites at Mockers Park, and then the wood pasture restoration site up at Mockers Hill Wood. But for today, we're going to be focusing on the work that's been going on in the Wyre Forest and its long history of adder studies. So yeah, let me just get this up and going. So the Wyre Forest is the largest continuous block of ancient woodland in the United Kingdom. It covers roughly 1,600 hectares of mixed woodland, I say all ancient. Some of it is pores, so plantation and ancient woodland site. And it covers the boundaries of Shropshire and Worcestershire. And of that 1,600 hectares, about 1,000 hectares, or 1,000 hectares, sorry, in English, is triple SI. And it's the largest woodland NNR in the whole of the UK. And it really is a special site. It's got a long history of study, but I think if we go back and look at why the Wyre Forest is still there, it's got a history of a heavily industrialised landscape. So this shot was probably taken around the turn of the century. You can see ladies doing sort of the tanning work, so the removing of the bark peel. And this was going on an industrial scale. So but I think what we need to look at in this picture particularly is the openness behind them. Yes, there is sort of trees and there is scrub behind them, but it's a relatively open scene. And of course, charcoal. You know, charcoal was vital to the industry of the wire, and it's what kept wire wooded basically over all those years. And then sort of the charcoal scene died off with the Industrial Revolution, and the woodland was left to sort of grow mature. And the Forest Commission came in sort of after the First World War and planted conifers. So the Wyre Forest, as I say, it's a special place. You know, we've got sort of 1,150 species of butterfly, 36 species of species of butterfly, 1,150 species of moth, and adders. And adders have been heavily studied. So the Reverend Joshua T. Lee, back at the turn of the century, set out to find out whether the dark grey and copper adders were a distinctly different species, or whether they were, you know, or whether they're in fact male or female. He killed 50 adders to determine this fact. And whilst he was at it, he also decided that he wanted to measure the average length of adders. And so he killed a further 500 adders, of which the average length was 56 centimetres. So you can see that even in that heavily industrialised landscape, adders were abundant, massively abundant. And so back in, so to say, we've got this history of the adders, and then luckily we've carried on having this very impressive survey data of the adders in the Wyre Forest. So Sylvia Sheldon and Chris Bagley have been studying the adders since 1979. This table goes back to 1990. But you can see that back in the 1990s, there was 56 sites surveyed, and there was sort of 240 adders on those sites. But then we've got an issue. So you've got the latest data here, which is 2018. You're down to sort of 39 adders on 11 sites, which is a massive decline. You know, okay, but the sites surveyed have gone down as well. So we're down from a peak of about 85 sites surveyed down to about 26. And all these sites are being mapped. It's not the bestest map, I'm sorry about that, but you can see that on this map, the green squares are adder locations across the Wyre. The orange are purple-bordered fritillary, which is another sort of very important species to the Wyre, the largest colony in the UK. And so we had to do something about this. And so we now manage the Wyre Forest jointly. So going back to what Nigel said about bigger and better, this is now bigger and better. This is a truly landscape scale woodland management going on between Forestry England and Natural England. Forestry England's lead on the timber production and the recreation side of stuff, and Natural England's, along with many other partner organisations, lead and provide the conservation biodiversity advice. And this is a really nice map. This is our vision for the Wyre Forest in 50 years' time. So you've got the blue checkered marks. These are coppice, so these are going to be on a coppice rotation, providing that constant light shade rotation. And then you've got these orange areas, the browny sort of orange areas, and these are open spaces. And all this open space planning has all come about through work that Nigel did back with Sylvia and Chris back sort of 10, 15 years ago in adder telemetry projects. So we know that in the Wyre Forest that they will move sort of up to 1 kilometre about the place. So all these open spaces are mapped to within 1 kilometre. But the problem is, at the moment, and the reason for this plan is we only have 11 sites with adders on. But I think as we increase the survey numbers, we are finding more and more individuals, but we're not finding large colonies. And so we have 11 sites, and some of these are literally down with an individual or 2 or 3. And I think the maximum population at the moment on the Bracken Bank is sort of 9, 10, maybe 13. And so we've got what's known as the wildlife corridor, which is this orange section to the east, which centres on the Bracken Bank, and that moves west, following basically the top of the Dowles bank, and that links up into the Forestry England side, which is mainly on this western side. And this links into other known adder populations. So you have Cadbury's Dead End Road and various other locations where there are adders, known adder hibernaculums. But as I say, you know, even these numbers aren't that great. So we had to go around creating this open space. And as I say, the MOU set out a clear plan of where this open space was going to be. So I'm just going to run through a few sorts of slides of how this open space was created and what we have now. So this is a Douglas fir timber stock taken back in about 2016, 17. And that was all clear felled to produce that. And the reason why we mulched it, because the original plan was these sites were going to be mechanically managed. And if you know anything about adder management, the idea of mechanically managing sites which are going to be hopefully sort of future adder areas, it isn't sensible. So they were mulched. For good or for bad, they were mulched. But it has given us sort of relatively clear sites. But we did start to leave these windrows, which you can see in sort of the right-hand corner. And so that's it from the view, from the area. So the bottom is south. So, you know, it's a lovely south-facing bank. And you can start to see these green slivers coming down. And these were deadwood piles. So when the mulching was taking place, we scraped up as much as we could, really. and put them into these long linear banks, and they've been really successful. So this is the same site literally 4 hours ago, and you can see it's developing really, really nicely. You know, you have a mixture of stuff going on there. You've got quite short sward in places, and you've got some birch regen coming through, you've got heather coming through, and sort of in the middle of the picture, it's quite hard to see on this one, you can see sort of the darker green areas here, and that's where these brash paths or these linear windrows have been left, and they've really started to develop very nicely. And so going back, we didn't want to manage these mechanically, so these have all now been invisibly fenced, and we graze them with cattle, and we try and graze them sort of generally in sort of late autumn, early winter, to try and minimise the impact on possible sort of basking adders and stuff. This is another site, so this is the same sort of thing, diamond site, 2017, heavily mulched, lovely. That's a whole south-facing bank, really, really fabulous. You know, it's one of the few places in the Wyre with views, really, really good. And this is the diamond site today. Once again, literally 4 or 5 hours ago. So you can see it's really developing nicely. And once again, you've got these linear wooden piles of brash. So it's not just brash, there's stumps, there's all sorts which have been pulled in there. And they are just providing the most fabulous habitat. And you walk along there and it's absolutely alive with lizards, various spiders and all sorts. It is absolutely wonderful. And I think Nigel saw the tail of something in one of those a while back, but we couldn't, unlike Nigel, couldn't actually tell what it was. But that's a close-up. You can see how it's, you know, we're getting quite a mosaic of structure within that area. You know, you have sort of very good basking spots in amongst the brambles. You've got the bracken coming through. And I just, you know, those are just fabulous, fabulous habitats. And then we have other areas where we're doing work as well. So this is down on the Dowles corridor. So this is about 250 metres south of, once again, another known adder location. But I say it's a known adder location. I only ever see the female up there. I saw her with a male once 2 years ago, but the records are very minimal. So, and she was on a large site. So once again, I think what's happened is she's been hanging on into this sub-optimum habitat and just clinging on for dear life. So we've opened it all up. So this was autumn 2018. And what we did here was, as you see, you can see all the clear felling on the bank, but this is an incredibly popular dog walking route. I mean, really, really popular. So we placed these long linear brash paths to just try and sort of stop the, you know, the hounds just randomly running through everywhere. And it's been incredibly successful. It just, as the bramble grows up across it, you can hardly see they're there. So this is a bit further along. So once again, this is about 4 or 5 hours ago. So you can see how that backside is developing nicely. We'll always have to come in and coppice the alders that are in the forefront of the picture here. But this is the remnant of the brash on the right-hand side of that picture there. And whilst that bit's exposed, you really can't see it now. It's vanished off into the distance. And it just makes it easier to manage. So you have these big rides. We're constantly sort of mowing these rides. But if we've got the habitat for the adders behind where we mow, we can still concentrate on butterfly species and other species in the sort of the main part of the ride, but still provide that sort of added habitat for the adders later on, further back. And this is probably the main study site in the Wyre Forest. So this is what's known as the Bracken Bank, obviously, and it was originally planted up with larch back in, I think it was 1970s. But the adders seem to love larch in the Wyre. They absolutely, you know, they don't have an issue with the larch in the Wyre at all until it gets to a certain age. And once it starts becoming, you know, 25, 30 foot tall, it starts to shade out and really starts forcing them out of there. So Natural England, or Nature Conservancy Council, I think, what it would have been back in the 90s, cut it all down. Illegally, actually. We didn't have a felling license for it. But anyway, it was done. But it's a really good, what I like and why I show the Bracken Bank, it's a really good study on a site that is heavily studied, but it's also a really good study on what happens when you take the eye off the ball a little bit. So you think, oh, this site is heavily studied, you know, we can't do any wrong in there. But it's surprisingly what you can actually do wrong in these areas. So that's 1999, it's relatively open. You've still got this footpath running through the middle, which wasn't necessarily too much of an issue there. That's 2006. You can see sort of a network of rides that are put in, which provide brilliant basking habitat. So back in 2006, I think there was still sort of 30 to 40 adders on this site. And then we still have this issue of how do you keep a site open, and so it was fenced. It was ring fenced all the way around, and we thought, yeah, that'd be great, fabulous. You know, we can put some cows on there, we can do it sensitively, and the cows won't kill the adders no matter what people say, and there's only a couple of them. But what we were finding was dog walkers, and a gun dog training group found this lovely enclosed area of the Wyre Forest, and we're actually training their gun dogs all through there. And generally, they seem to really like doing it in February and March, which of course wasn't really ideal. But as I say, you look at that picture now, and then you look at it, 2018, it really has birched up. That's all I can say, really. So we've taken our eye off the ball there. You know, the prime adder site in the Wyre Forests, trees grow slowly, and you don't notice. And it's only when you really start to look or re-evaluate a site as to why the adder population is declining, ignoring the fact that some clever person decided to put a weather station right in the middle of it, possibly by their hybernaculums. So just on the sort of the mid-left, there's a square bit there. That a weather station was put in, yeah, and adders have never been seen in that area since. So as I say, the Bracken Bank, we're now on the process of removing at least 50% of that birch, and it's a slow process. So we've mapped all the hybernaculums on there, and I go out every year with Sylvia and Chris, and I make sure that the work we're planning for the winter is precise and is well targeted. But what I think is quite interesting is that we always have this perception of adders as being very, very loyal to their hybernaculum sites, and that the females will come out and they'll only bask next to the hybernaculums. There's a female just by the gateway who hasn't been seen for, well, I say it's the female, I don't think it is the same one, but it was a well-known hybernaculum site, but it got shaded out, and we cut down all the birch, removed that shade, and I think it was last year, Sylvia saw a female back on that site. But the problem we're having now is that site survey is 26. But when you look at that picture and you look at the potential adder habitat, and as much as we like employing Nigel all the time to go out and look for adders in our woodland, we have more sites than we can survey, and it's a real issue going forward, because the survey of the adders in the Wyre plays a vital importance to how we plan our forestry works, because at the end of the day, the history of the Wyre, and especially working with the Forest Commission, is that it's a worked woodland. And a lot of the species in the Wyre respond to that constant change of light, shade, darkness, you know, and so it is a worked woodland, and mapping the adders and mapping the hybernaculums is vitally important. And we get adder reports nowadays from all across the forest, from the far south, right next to the recreation centre where there's a possible dog bite, right into the middle where, you know, in between the Bracken Bank and Cadbury's Dead End Road, females have been seen. You know, I saw my first male this year under a tin at Lodge Hill, and they haven't been seen in Lodge Hill since the early 90s. So what I'd really like is to try and enhance the amount of survey work we do, and I'm open to suggestions about how we can do that, because it is a sensitive site, and more importantly, people have to be prepared to go out and look in places where they might not see an adder. But that information is as important as seeing an adder in the wire, you know, because if we can categorically say they're not there, we can do stuff with more confidence. But the last thing I want to do is approve woodland work and have, you know, the possibility of damaging or destroying a hybernaculum. So yeah, going forward, what is the future of these isolated populations? Because as I said, some of these populations are incredibly isolated. It's the future of these isolated populations. You know, are they genetically diverse enough? You know, if we literally have sites where you know, anyway, we talked about in the last one, and can productive forestry fit with conserving and enhancing adder populations? The more I work at the Wyre, the more I think it can. We just need to be able to plan it. And in the West Midlands, with the declining adder populations, maybe the Wyre is a perfect future ARG site for some of these species, especially the adder, because, you know, we have now these large dedicated open areas. Let's say it's all up for discussion. And so, yeah, that's the end of me. So a big thank you to Phil Radlin for the Forestry England, Sylvia Sheldon and Chris Bradley, and of course, Nigel for all the work that he does over there, sniffing out adders for us.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really interesting. I believe we've got Getan coming up next, but is he around at all, or we can have...
Nigel, I think Gaten's there, but he was asking earlier whether we could see him or not, and clearly we can't.
No, we can't.
You don't see me?
No, can you share your screen though, Gaetan?
Sorry?
Can you share your screen?
Yeah, I share my screen.
Okay.
You hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Yes. Hi everybody. I will talk to you about challenges of conserving adders in France and in Hauts-de-France. Actually, now I work in Hauts-de-France for an action plan of adders. And in France, we have three main challenges in France. The first one is to stop destruction of adders habitats. The second one is to improve social perception and status of protection of adders and of all of the vipers in France. And the last one is to reduce climate change. For each challenges, I will try to make a short assessment in France. I begin with the first one is to stop destruction of adders habitats in France. I show to you two recent cases of landscape modification in France. I think they represent a part of the evolution of countryside in France. The first case is a study about three colleagues. They work on the West France here in Vendée, the red point. It's the result about a long-term monitoring in an agricultural hedgerow landscape. Here on this map, the green patch represents the density of hedgerow in France. Here we have a higher density of hedgerow in France. My colleagues make a survey. Here you can see aerial photography where the study took place in Vendée. This area is around 2,500 500 hectares. They make a first survey during the period between 1994 and 1997. You can see here the header occurrence, the red cycle, everywhere in this area. And after a few years, my colleague came back in for a second survey between 2012 and 2015. And here you can see the header occurrence in the same area. In 20 years, 90% of headers distribution on this area disappear in this hedgerow countryside. On this place, they make some capture on 3 populations. And here you can see the trends of these 3 hedgers population in hedgerow landscape. And they almost disappear, and it's alarming us. We are very disturbing because this place where they make the study is here, the south limit of area distribution in France, and the headers disappear on this place. Why they disappear on this place? Here you can see some picture of this on this area. You can see that hedgerow are almost destroyed. It's the same place. 10 years. In 10 years, they destroy all of hedgerow in this area. And on the same place, you can see that there is a lot of intensification agricultural practices. They destroy grassland with a beautiful hedgerow for hedgers to plant some corn field or to open field with wheat. And the second example that I want to show you is in north of France. Here, you can see the red points. We discovered on this place a population of headers. It's an historical site where headers have not seen since 10 years, in September 2008. And 1 year after, we came back again on this place to make a second survey for estimate the population of headers. And in 1 year, this place was destroyed for plants, a cornfield for game crop. Yeah. And there is a very, very bad news for us, because on this place there is a countryside with a chalk grassland, and on the chalk grassland they release more and more pheasants, and they put on the down of the chalk grassland, they destroy grassland to put some cornfield for boar. They want to have a lot of more and more boar on this place, and boar with header are not very friendly. And the problem in this area, there is a private areas with no areas protection, and it's very difficult to talk with the owner of this place. And the problem in France, I talked to that after, is header are not full protected species in France. It's a problem. And we have a problem with economic stakes of hunting and game farming against header conservation. The second challenge in France is to improve social perception and status of protection. During a long time, for most of reptiles experts and land managers, vipers in France are common for them, and they don't care about them. It's a very bad. This bad thinking in France is a good example about what Kevin Gaston wrote in his studies. And Gaston is right. In in 10, 20 years ago, maybe the vipers are common in France, but now all of the species of vipers and eiders are endangered in France. And it's a long time, it's an historical behavior in France. We have a very long story about bad habits with vipers. Here you can see some historical postcards, it's all the postcards. You can see some vipers hunter. They are paid by local authority to kill vipers in France. And we can, more example, here I translate for you what is watched on this all the postcards. And when we look in the historical books and articles, we find some all interesting testimonies of vipers hunter in France. Here, in 1963, a woman is a vipers hunting, killed more 2,000 heads of vipers. And she said in 1963 that she don't find a lot of vipers, and they are not a very high density. It's very interesting. And we can find some another testimonies in 1901 in Burgundy. People killed 26,000 vipers. And in another country in France, in De Sèvres, in the west of France, they destroy 50,000 vipers in 5 years. And vipers hunting are paid by a pharmaceutical laboratory in France for antivenom produce. For Institut Pasteur in 1956, they killed around 20,000 vipers by years for antivenom producing. And the first law of nature protection in France is in 1979. At this time, there is 20 vipers hunters in activities. They killed around 15,000 vipers each year, by years, sorry. These figures are very impressive. And with this first law, the government prohibits vipers hunting. They can't continue their activities to kill viper. Anybody can to pay us to kill vipers at this time, but after this law, the viper hunting continue, and the last one is maybe in Burgundy in 1986. And the destruction for pharmaceutical laboratory continue during 2 years. All of this history show us that the vipers hunting have a huge impact on viper populations, and they contribute, transmit generation by generation to have a bad perception and fear of a viper, and people have this reflex action to kill a viper when they see one. It's a very big problem in France. And now you can find some chemical products in France against the snakes. You can see here an eider. It's available in a garden center in France, and it's produced in France. It's a chemical product. And destruction still authorized in France. It's a huge problem. Now we create a vipers expert group, and we work to change the status of vipers, and conservation status currently under revision. We talk with the government now, and to maybe the habitats of all of the reptiles in France will be protected, but the problem is the status of two species of eiders, two species of vipers, sorry, Vipera berus and Vipera aspis. still authorized to be killed. It's a very problem. We try to change it with the government. And in France, we have a last challenge is the climate change. I'll show you a short abstract about the PhD work on impact of climate change on Eider in Auvergne. It's here in the center of France, the mountain Auvergne. It's the most southern area, Eider's area in France, maybe in Europe. And this it's an isolated population here, and the species are present because of the mountains. During this study, the PhD tested different scenarios of temperature increase with a maximum of 3.7 degrees. It tests is a scenario between 2017 and 2100. It's the scenario B1, and it looks what is the impact on Eider's area distribution in the future for Eiders. Here you can see the Auvergne, it's a mountain area. It's a prediction of area Eider's distribution now. You can see here the patch with a lot of color. And on this patch, he tests different scenario of temperature increase. And here, if the temperature increase about less 1 degrees, the area Eider distribution is just here, the color. In a brown area, the old is now the area distribution, and here the new distribution in the future, if you have 25% of the scenario. If the temperature increases around 2 degrees, here you can see the Eiders climb on the mountain, and the population still stay on the place where the mountain are the highest, the mountain. And if the scenario is 3.7 degrees, the Eider disappear in 15 years in Auvergne, in France. It's a very interesting study, and we are very worried about that. Next step in France, we have a lot of works. With the national group, we try to improve hedgerow landscape conservation because more and more hedgerows are destroyed in France actually, because the political European agriculture change, and a lot of people destroy hedgerow, and we want to change the legal status of vipers. We want to obtain a full protection. It's very important, because if we have not obtained the full protections of Eider, it's very difficult to work with the farmer, with the land manager to protect and conserve vipers in France. And we try to develop a large scale of conservation programs. We want to create a national action plans for 2 species of vipers, Vipera berus and Vipera aspis. We expect that this program take place next year. We wait for the government response about our proposition. Thanks a lot. I hope that I speak clearly and my English is not so bad.
Thank you very much, Gaetan. I think we'll go on to Rick. At the end of Rick's presentation, we'll talk about some of the presentations, and maybe the presenters can give us some answers to questions. Okay, let's go on to Rick.
Okay, well, I hope everyone can hear me clearly.
Yes.
I've now got, you know, very good, okay. The Kent Reptile Amphibian Group has got a project for helping adders, which has been running for quite a long time now, and that's just shown here, helping adders up ladders. And it's had quite a large reach from one time or another, and I was, right at the very introduction, I mentioned that Gaetan and his team at Conservation, the Conservatoire de Espace Naturel, have been working with us, and we've done various things, including adder monitoring together, developing habitat suitability index for reptiles, and even produced an adder land management leaflet. But I won't be talking about those things today. What I want to talk about is our long-term adder monitoring project on the North Downs in Kent. So it's going to be about fluctuations in adder populations, and it perhaps won't come as a great surprise to you that the fluctuations that I'm particularly worried about are the ones that have been going consistently downwards over some time. So in the next slide, what I'm going to show you is the problem, and then we're going to be considering the problem after that. So here is the problem. We started our monitoring in 2008, and we're still doing it in 2020. And on the x-axis here, sorry, I beg your pardon, the y-axis here, you have the adder encounter rate. So it's the recording rate, number of adders recorded in a year. And during the first few years, things were looking pretty rosy, really. If you look here, things were going upwards. And by the time we got to 2012, we really were very pleased with ourselves. After that, things fell apart. And as you can see, we've been heading downwards fairly consistently. Little bumps and a little bit of an upturn here at the end, but things have been looking disappointing. And the purpose of this talk is to try and explain what has been going on here. But before I do that, I think I need to tell you a little bit about the site where we work and how we've been monitoring our adders, and then we can go on to consider what's going on. Okay, so here is our chalk grassland site. It's on the Downs in North Kent, and you can see that we've got three areas we're working in. Area 1 here, which is a west-facing site, west-facing slope, and it slopes into a valley. Here's the valley here. Area 2 is now outside of the valley, and it's sloping towards the southwest. And then here is area 3, and area 3 slopes to the south. So they've all got different aspects. They're all about the same sort of size. Between each of the areas, there are quite extensive areas of tall scrub. So they are separated from each other, and they are managed by extensive grazing which starts usually towards the end of August and carries on until about November. 3 sites. What's quite noticeable though is that the site area 2 and area 3 are much more exposed. They get a lot more sunshine, they get a lot more wind. When you go into the valley and start facing west, then the site is much less exposed. So there's potentially quite a big difference between, say, area 1 and area 2 and 3. Now let's go on to how we've been monitoring our adders on these 3 areas here. So here is a brief description of our monitoring. If you want to know more about how we've been doing it, there is actually a publication which explains that in some detail, and that's down here at the bottom. But in brief, we make about 70 visits annually to the reserve. That's about 9 or 10 visits a month. Between the months of March and October. And we record adders along standardized survey paths and at refuges of corrugated iron and roofing felt. Individual adders are recognized by their head scale patterns. We take pictures of these and the pictures are put in a database and we can recognize our adders. And to date, we have about 550 individual adders in our database. And about 7% of those we have recorded from the first year of life through to adulthood. We don't actually come across many new adult adders. Most of the adult adders we have seen as immatures. So maybe 2 or 3 adult adders appear in the year. I think this is partly because, one, we work very hard on the site, but also the site is relatively isolated, so there's not much in the way of immigration into the site from outside, because the areas outside are unsuitable for adders. Okay, it's now time to return to our problem. Oh, I tell you what, before we get to our problem, if we're really lucky, then this is what we find under our refuges. In fact, in the early years, this was not particularly uncommon. I don't know how many adders you think you can see there. There are a couple of grass snakes on the top, which are shedding. And then if you look at it very closely, you can see there are 3 adders there. And probably under that lot, there might be a couple of slow worms as well. In recent years, I've never seen a haul as good as that one. So now onto our problem again. So this was the graph you saw earlier, the rather fancy and attractive front end, and then that horrible decline thereafter. And I've added a further line, a green line there, which is the total number of known adders in each of those years. And you'll see that the known adders and the adder encounter rate track each other fairly closely. And the number of known adders has also declined. So it's not just the rate at which we're encountering them that's declined, but it's the number of known adders also that has been going down, which clearly is quite worrying. Now, in order to try and explain what's going on, what we need to do is to look at each of those 3 areas in the reserves individually. So that's what we're going to do next, starting with area 3. So there is area 3. Now, the red line here is the adder encounters. That's the frequency of observation. And the sort of pinkish purplish line here at the top is the number of known adders. And you'll see that the pattern displayed here was very similar to the one I displayed in the last slide. Rising really quite steeply up to 2012, and thereafter a decline with a little bit of an upturn at the end. So that's area 3, and area 3 clearly is following the pattern that you saw earlier. Now to go to area 2. Area 2, also much the same sort of thing, but the magnitude is different, but still heading downwards. And finally, area 1. Area 1 is completely different. It showed that increase up to about 2011, 2012, and the number of known adders thereafter remained fairly constant. What dropped was the frequency with which we were seeing them, the encounter rate. So area 1 seemed to be working at a very different perspective from the other 2 areas. So the question then is, how do we explain all this? Just to summarize, that's the known adders. So we would have thought, of course, that area 3 was the best of all the areas, at least initially, up to 2012. Area 3 was the one we enjoyed visiting most of all. But Area 3 then fell apart. Area 2 started off really well, even better than Area 1, but gradually drifted down. But Area 1 is the one that has really come through and been quite successful, remains successful, even if we have had a little bit of a dip here in the last few years. It's still doing pretty well. So what might be the cause of this? Well, just going to consider one or two of the possibilities of differences between the 3 areas. Now, the first one would perhaps be predation. Could there be more predation in areas 2 and 3 than in area 1? Well, the predators we've got are badgers, foxes, birds, occasional weasel, but to be honest, these are not different between the 3 areas. They all seem to be very much the same. Food supply. Could there be a difference in food supply between the 3 areas? We've never had any evidence of this. We see plenty of common lizards on all 3 areas, lots of shrews, plenty of rodents, particularly appearing under the refuges. And in the early years of our monitoring, we were also doing small mammal surveys, and that never showed up any shortage of food. So we don't think that food supply is an issue. Disturbance. Well, we got that grazing I mentioned, but that applies to all 3 areas equally. We have a lot of walkers, but they keep to the paths. Plenty of photographers, but they are extremely respectful and careful and don't seem to pose any particular problem. So predation, food supply, disturbance don't look as if they are particular causes of the problem we've observed. Climate. Well, we've had some pretty hot summers, but then they've been hot for all the 3 sites. And we've had some pretty warm winters, which of course are not good for adders. They tend to run out of their fat supplies because they're physiologically too active during warm winters. But that would apply to all 3 sites. But the thing I think is possibly different is the very dry summers. Because area 1, as I mentioned before, is sheltered. Much less wind action, much less sunshine, and looks a bit greener in the really dry periods. So my suspicions are that it's basically a bit moister, at least from the adder's perspective. Now, the effect of dry summers on adders wouldn't be a big surprise. Certainly in continental Europe, people consider that the adder is an animal of the wet heath. It's not something we consider here particularly, but it's wet heath in continental Europe. There are actually also other clues, and they relate to what's happened to our slow worms on the same 3 sites. So the next thing I'm going to do is show you a picture of what happened to the slow worms. For those of you who attended the Southeast Area ARG in 2018, this picture will be familiar because we were considering slow worms and their relationship with moisture then. And what you can see here, and the red line is the encounter rate for slow worms, and here the rainfall. And that rainfall is the number of days in April and May with rain at greater than 1 millimeter. And you'll see there's a very, very strong relationship between slow worm encounter rate and rainfall. This is not necessarily a big surprise because slow worms do need rainfall to encourage their prey out, and most of their prey are mollusks. So if it's very dry, slow worms don't get much food and therefore disappear from view. And so this is no great surprise. And should just mention at the top here, very, very nice correlation between these two lines. Now let's look and see how slowworms and adders compare to each other. Now this is a comparison between slowworms and adders from Area 3. If you look at the start here, the slowworm line and the adder line doesn't match up at all until you get to 2011. After 2011, adders and slowworms have almost the same encounter rate, or at least the shape of the curve of the encounter rate is much the same. The rises and falls follow each other. So there's a very strong correlation between these two, and the correlation is given here. Correlation coefficient of only a little bit under 1. So correlation for that period there from 2011 to 2020, this year. And so it may well be that the factor that is affecting the slowworms may also affect the adders equally. Could it be that adders are suffering the effects of perhaps climate change, of much drier summers, hence the consistent fall since 2011? If that were true, it wouldn't necessarily be a big surprise, because we were warned. There have been climate change projections for adder distribution in the UK, and they show that the distribution of adders will be shrinking. And that's the next slide. Here you see adders affected by climate warming. The figure here is a projection based on actually low emissions. So in other words, it's only a 2 degrees rise in temperature by 2080. It could be potentially much more, but that's the low emissions projection. And you'll see here down in the southeast of England, we've got expected changes, which will be losses in 2020. That's the brownish bits here, and also even more extensive by 2050. So potentially we should be looking for climate change induced losses of distribution by about now. And who knows, that may be what we've got. Okay, so let's just summarize what we've said so far then. First of all, there can be wide fluctuations in adder numbers between what are effectively here subpopulations. They're subpopulations. And this is reasonably understandable in that the subpopulation in one area is in a different habitat from the other two areas. And we've got very distinct differences, as you've seen. On chalk grassland, in some places and at some times, adders may be limited by lack of moisture. It's easy to understand this in the case of chalk grassland because there's no surface water anywhere, there are no ponds, and it drains very well. Whether the same constraints would apply to other areas, I don't know, but certainly if you were looking for moisture-related constraints, then chalk grassland is exactly the place where you'd expect to find them. These observations may be the first indications of climate change impacts on adders. Well, this may be true, it may not be true, but it looks as if it may be, and perhaps only time will tell whether it really is. Also, of course, we've not yet done any very detailed analysis of our data, and that will be required before we can be very sure of exactly what is going on here. And finally, adder habitats prone to desiccation could benefit from the addition of water features such as ponds. This is not a revolutionary idea at all. In fact, in Germany, they have been doing this for a long time, and the Germans consider that if you have a habitat that is designed for the conservation of adders, then it's very important that ponds are included, not just to provide drinking water, but also, of course, ponds great amphibian habitats, and amphibians provide additional prey for adders. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Rick. Have any of the panelists got any questions for the speakers at this point? I thought they were all really, really interesting presentations, and I think Gaetan did very well with his English, much better than I would have done with French. What I would say with Tom's presentation, I found it very interesting. I noticed you mentioned ARG sites at the end, Tom. That was great, and I think that's something that we have certainly been talking about in the Midlands. And when we reflect on Worcestershire as a county, I believe we really only have 2 really big viable adder populations left now. The Wyre being one, and the Malvern Hills being the other one, really. And that is a worry. Adders are very localised.
Well, that's if you consider the Wyre a population that is sustainable. I worry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but never.
I think it is that desperate now that these are really the only 2 places. With Gaetan's presentation, he did mention game birds as well. And I could see game bird sort of habitat, crops along the edges there. That is interesting. That's an issue in France as well. Something that obviously is a big problem in the UK. And no doubt we can probably talk about that a bit later on. And Rick's talk definitely that the ponds are an interesting feature. In the Wyre Forest, we actually work with Tom putting ponds into the Wyre Forest, temporary ponds, because species like common frog are a certain prey species for juvenile adders. And obviously the desiccation, believe desiccation has been a problem in the Netherlands as well with viviparous lizards. Okay. Anybody else got anything they want to add to that?
Okay, I'm going to chip in Nigel.
Yeah.
So we've got 22 questions. Some of them are quite specific to the presentations, and I've lost them now. I said I'd help you with this. There's a very general one about climate change from Mike Phillips, so I'm going to ask that on his behalf. So Mike's question is, a question for all of the panellists: given that climate change is likely to pose additional difficulties for species at the southern end of their range, such as adders, is there an argument that focusing our conservation efforts in southern England and France on different species might be a better use of precious resources? That's very controversial, Mike. What do you? I'm going to ask Gaetan first. What do you think, Gaetan? Are we wasting our time?
Okay.
Sorry?
Do you think that all is lost for adders? Is it worth continuing if we think climate change will wipe them out anyway?
Sorry, the sound is cut.
Okay. Is it? Do you think everything is lost for adders in France, Gaetan? Is it worth, with climate change happening, is it worth continuing to try and conserve them in these marginal areas?
It's a good question, because a lot of people say maybe in the margin of the area with the climate change, preserve adders is not benefits for the species, because with climate change she will disappear. But the problem in France that maybe in the north of the area distribution, the habitats are not benefits for the species, and with the climate change, maybe adders disappear in 50 years in France, and lots of people say that adders will be disappear, and we can find in the north of France another species, Vipera aspis. But Vipera aspis now in France, the trends of populations are very, very bad, and they decrease very fast like adders. And probably we have the Vipera aspis not occupy the north area in France, because she disappeared in the same time with adders.
Okay. And Rick, what do you think? What do you think about adders in Kent?
I suppose if I was being facetious, I'd say I'd be putting my order in now for some aspic vipers from Gaitan. But no, I haven't given up hope at all. I think that there might be an element of selection going on. So adders might even evolve to some degree. They may be able to adjust. They are quite an adaptable creatures, but there is a limit to that, of course. In the case of the North Downs, we might need to think about changing our management practices. For instance, not cutting back the cover quite so much, leaving much more shade. Maybe there are ways that we can supply water. Let's assume it's just water, not temperature. So in my presentation, I was really just considering moisture because that's what we know about, and that's what how the slow worms have been suffering, because of lack of moisture. It didn't seem to be high temperatures, but temperatures are important for adders as well. And we will hang in there. We're never going to give up, is the answer.
Okay, and Tom, what about you? Why, are you going to carry on with the adders?
Yeah, of course we'll carry on with the adders, but I think in the Wyre, the more we look about and the more we find isolated populations, I think we're realizing that actually they're not necessarily in the Wyre a species of necessarily open dominated spaces. You know, we are finding them in what would generally be suboptimal sort of habitat, which in high summer provides a lot of shade. But in the springtime when the leaves are off the trees, you know, we have been finding them in areas where you think, well, you know, they shouldn't really be there. So I think in the Wyre we've got the scope because of the you know, the natural shadiness of a lot of the areas where they're not restricted just to an open down site, for example. They can move, and they are moving, and they definitely move from their spring hibernacles into probably summer feed areas. And those you know, yeah, those are all across the forest. So no, we're not giving up.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you want me to go through these questions?
Yeah, if you go through the questions, Angie, we can answer them as a group.
Okay. There's one about adders and grass snakes in Scotland. I think it's a bit grass snaky, so I might let Chris Catherine talk to whoever it is about that. Okay. So the first question is for Tom. You've mentioned that adder populations are often small in the reserve. Are the populations still connected? And if not, is there any evidence that genetic diversity or lack of could be contributing further to the decline?
Well, there is no evidence, particularly in the Wyre, of genetic diversity. But I attended the Vanishing Viper conference 2 years ago as well. So I think that's high on the agenda, and would be something we'd like to study in the future. But as for isolated populations, part of the reason of that management plan and that screenshot I showed you of the 50-year vision of the forest is to make sure that these populations aren't isolated. And even though it's a big site, you know, as I say, those open spaces, those open areas, all linked with the connectivities of these big wide rides, it really shouldn't mean that those populations are isolated anymore. I think historically they were isolated, but I really don't think that they are constrained by geography nowadays. There's definitely movement possibilities.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Gaetan, do you have any evidence for genetic inbreeding in your French populations?
Yes, 5 years ago we have a genetic study in the north of France, and most of the Ager's populations are inbreeding genetics, and it's a problem because almost of the population are isolated, and it's a problem. We try to work with land manager to preserve area between two Ager's population, because the genetics isolation is another challenge for us, because Ager are destroyed in France, and the adders can't move. And we have a lot of inbreeding population. We have the same problem in Belgium near the French North French borders. They have a lot of inbreeding genetic population, and they try to make search my words. They try to they pick up adders, and they pick up in the seat number 1 to put on the seat number 2 to make some genetics exchange by human. But in France, it's not possible to take adders in different sites, and we try to work on landscape. And the genetics inbreeding is a huge problem for us.
Rick, what do you think on your 3 sites? Do you have any sense of inbreeding?
Not at all, no, I very much doubt it. It's reasonable numbers of adders there. What is clear is that they are subpopulations. They do move between the areas, but particularly the adults come back, of course, whereas the neonates and the juveniles tend to set up shop in other parts, other areas. And this gives me hope that if conditions do improve, Area 1 will be able to feed into Areas 2 and 3 and repopulate them. And I've got no sense of any either genetic or other population problems.
And Nigel, I know you did the study with IOZ. What was the thought?
It was interesting, the study. We looked at a number of sites across central and southern England. Many of the West Midlands sites, there was evidence for inbreed, sort of relatedness. There was a lot of evidence for population being related. And I think the big problem is that a lot of the population is so small to actually detect the issues with inbreeding. I think the population is too small to get really good samples from, really, in a lot of cases. And that's a problem. And also the adder breeding strategies, they do sort of multiple mate as well. So obviously, you know, many males from that same group will be mating with particular females. But, you know, I know ARG are developing some strategies on population management in the future, and there is talk about sort of doing some work with adder population on obviously potential reintroductions elsewhere as well.
Okay. There's
Hello,
questions. Trying to go through all the questions. There's quite a few about moving animals around. Does anybody have a view about moving adders? I know Gaetan said they did. Does anyone, the specific question is, would you move them between isolated populations or populations under pressure, e.g. from a development, to bolster genetic stock and numbers on other more secure sites? Nigel.
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's obviously going to come up a lot more in the future. I think with regards to moving adders around, and there's a lot of problems. It's actually finding robust donor populations to actually move, and obviously if it's a commercial development, then obviously that will be a population. It's how far you move those animals and which animals are the best ones to move. I think in reality we don't have huge amounts of data on how successful this is. Obviously there has been work done in the past, and there's been some evidence of really poorly conducted projects. In my personal view, after radio tracking adders a great deal, is I think some adders certainly will take to being moved, and you obviously got to get the habitat correct. I don't think, you know, our feeling for habitat may always be right. You've got to really think about the microclimates and the habitat and high binocular availability. And possibly if there's already been a few animals already moved there over a longer period, they can actually clue into those snakes that are already there. I believe that work has been done with timber rattlesnakes and rattlesnakes in America by adding snakes over successive years, it will work. Anybody else?
Rick?
I'm certainly in favour of moving adders where it can be justified, and that's the catch. Where can you actually justify doing it? So I would really like to see some kind of expert body which would help guide people to make decisions about when it is and when it isn't justified, because I think it's a complex issue.
Yeah.
And really, we can't go through all the issues here and now. But I think there are considerable advantages from this, but we need to get it right. Need to take into account disease transmission. Need to make sure that we're not just wasting adders by moving from one place to another where it's completely unsuitable.
I think
lots of other considerations.
I would also add to that you wouldn't want to move adders that exist on a heathland to a grassland site. There may be differences in how the adders behave, what they're feeding on. Heathland adders may feed quite regularly on lizards, for instance, whereas grassland adders or sort of woodland edge adders may favour and be feeding on voles. So I think there's a lot of considerations and how far you actually move them, what sort of radius are you talking about, and not depleting a population to take them to another one.
I should add, of course, ARG UK has been working with our trust to develop some recommendations on this particular subject, and those will appear soon. Whether we will ever get a sort of standing body that can help people who want to make these kind of translocations, I don't know. I think there was some resistance to that, and that disappoints me because I think it would be very worthwhile.
Okay, I'm just going to ask Tom now from a land manager's perspective, particularly a Natural England land manager's perspective. I don't want to put you on the spot, so if you don't...
Thank you.
Do you think it would it be something you'd consider?
Yes, personally, with my personal hat on rather than Natural England hat on. And and if I'm honest with you, I don't see why Natural England would have a huge issue with it either. If the donor site was, say, under Bracken development, then of course, yeah, you know, as long as you go through the hoops that Rick was talking about. But I sometimes feel that we need to be bolder. We need to be a bit more adventurous. And, you know, these sites where we have limited populations, and if we are, you know, if we do know that there is a donor site that has even more limited population, then sometimes I think we're going to have to make the choice, because we can watch adders decline on a dead end site forever. And, you know, and in 10 years' time, you go, well, there were adders here, there were 3 there. You know, now they've all died. But, you know, there's all the considerations to point out, you know, about age of adders and stuff like that. And Nigel's had a lot more experience than I have. But Nigel will also know that I'm quite keen and very open to the discussion about it all. I just think maybe we do need to just be, you know, be a bit more proactive and just say, okay, we really do think we have this issue, and I can't see why we wouldn't have a genetics issue in the Wyre, especially nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we just need to be bolder, more adventurous, and take the ball by the horns.
I think, can I just add to this, that I think the worst thing that could happen is that if people feel passionate about their adders, that they start taking them off the site and have their own private agendas going. That would worry me, concern me as to snakes going missing on sites to go to other sites. And also you've got to have got in place why the adders declined on a site previously, you know, work out as best as you can the issues, and not compromise the adder population. You know, if you let them go, will management for another species affect them because they haven't consulted with the person on site, really? I certainly think about things like that, and obviously it's got to go through the right channels.
Okay, Gaëtan, is there a French perspective on moving adders around?
Can you repeat, please?
In France, how do people feel about moving animals around different sites to conserve them in France?
In France, a lot of people are not agreed to move edges between the different sites. People say that we have to work on habitats before to move some edges in sites. And the problem in France is that we don't know really the area distribution of the different species like adders in my county, in Hauts-de-France. Every year we find 2 or 3 adders population, and it's difficult for us to know how many populations we have, and if these populations are in good health or not, we don't know. And it's difficult for us to say that, well, maybe this population is small and we take an adders here and put an adders that. We don't have any information to make that now, and we don't realize that. My Belgian, like I said, my Belgian colleague developed a breed center of adders, and they make breeding adders at home, and they release adder in different sites. But in France, it's forbidden to catch adders with no authorization to put another site. It's a very incense. It's very strange because you can kill an adder. It's not prohibited, but if you catch an adder to put another site, it's forbidden, and you can. It's not allowed. It's very strange in France.
Mm. It's so interesting, the differences.
It is.
So we need to finish soon. I think we just had a few questions about dogs and dog walkers and adders, and I know this is probably a half-hour discussion, but perhaps if the panel could all give their views on how best to manage people and dogs and adders. And I think maybe start with Tom, because I know you've had a lot of experience with this.
Put big signs up saying adders kill dogs. You have to be really subtle. And I think it's very much about doing the stuff that I said, about using well-placed sort of brash piles. There is a certain amount of education that can go on. But I really think the dog walkers that generally cause the troubles and the issues to the adder populations are also the ones that you can't educate, because they're the ones that aren't interested. They just go out and they're using it as their exercise area. So as I said, I think it's just about subtle land management changes, and they've got to be subtle, because if you put something too obvious in, they deliberately sort of go for it. But I think we're being quite successful in the Wyre at the moment with just these subtle land manager changes and locking the odd game. So I don't have any golden bullets. I'm sorry.
Okay, Rick, what do you think?
Well, I have very little personal experience of this, apart from one dog walker who was using one of our paths and managed to get bitten on the ankle, and he was very philosophical about it. He decided it was entirely his fault, because it wasn't his dog who was bitten, it was just him. But perhaps the fact that he was leading a dog was part of the problem. But yes, he was philosophical and blamed himself and not the adder. And within about 3 or 4 days, he was back walking his dog as usual. So I think that's the sort of dog walker we want, one that is aware, is tolerant, and sympathetic. Unfortunately, there are not very many of those. Shame we can't have more. But I think, yes, if we are going to put signs up, then I think there are some probably very imaginative signs that can be put up that instead of the beware danger adders, just adders deserve their peace as well, please be kind to them, will engender a lot more sympathy.
Okay, and Gaëtan, what about in France? Is there an issue with dog walkers, or do you not have them in France?
We have no problem with dog walkers in France. The problem with dogs is during hunting periods in France. We have a lot of dogs attacks agers, and agers attacks dogs because a lot of hunting actions in France. It's open now, and we have a lot of problem with dogs during this period. But with the dogs walker, we have no problem. No people say, "Oh, my dogs had bit by hiders or anything else." We have not this kind of information. Just except in a hunting period with hunters, a lot of hunters say to me, and they destroy vipers because they attack their dogs and they are afraid about their health, dogs' health, and they kill vipers during this period. But not with the dog walkers, they are not a problem.
Okay, and then Nigel, over to you, and I think you can finish up then because we're at 9 o'clock.
Yeah. With the dog side of things, I suppose in the ideal world, I would love all the conservation bodies to agree on one set sort of regard for how you sort of manage dogs. And so ideally, they should all be on a lead and they should be controlled, and even having dog wardens walking around the site and, dare I say, telling people off for letting their dogs run in it. That would be great. I see a lot of also the issues of professional dog walkers taking groups of dogs out. I think that was a problem in the Wyre, wasn't it, Tom, at one point? And you mentioned gun dogs. So yeah, it is a big problem, and I think it can only get worse with more housing, more development. Where we are in the Midlands, they're talking about trying to build dog agility areas and dog exercise areas to take the pressure off these sites, and perhaps that's a way forward. There's a lot we could have talked about tonight, and I think there's probably loads of questions that we could have answered, and it's an enjoyable part of the actual seminar, really, and maybe we can look at some of the questions later on. But I'd like to thank everybody for speaking tonight, and it's great to hear from the contribution from everyone, including Gaëtan, the French view of adders. And it's quite sad. I think something like adders are amazing would have worked really well in France. A project such as that, or what's that snake? They definitely need some big education projects. But I think I'd like to thank everyone, and I hope everybody enjoyed it out there listening in. And let's have another one at some point. We have got more ARG seminars coming up, haven't we, Angie? We've got them all the way into December. So
yeah, we've got them at 2 weekly intervals, and the next one, which I'm going to put in a plug for, is on South Africa. And I know people were a bit like, whoa, how about that? But really, we need to learn from, as we're learning from Gaëtan tonight, it'd be really interesting to learn from a country that has a lot of venomous snakes and quite a lot of issues with public perceptions of snakes. And we're looking forward to introducing Fortunate, who's going to talk about Youth for African Wildlife, and Nick, who saves mambas. This is a man who saves mambas. And Pete Gillette is going to introduce that, and he'll be with us in 2 weeks on Thursday on the 1st of October. So sign up now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
So, and I'd also like to thank, on behalf of ARG UK, everybody for giving up their time as a panelist, for preparing presentations, and also for joining us this evening. It's just great to be able to use technology to get around the restrictions we've had and still get together. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Be safe.
Yes, be safe.